Welcome to NCJW Chicago North Shore's discussion with Linda Gartz, author of Redlined, a memoir of race, change, and fractured community in 1960s Chicago. I am Debbie Wiedinghoff, president of the Chicago North Shore section. Before I introduce Linda Gartz, as always, there are a few Zoom reminders to share. You all have been muted for the first portion of the presentation. Please keep yourself muted to help minimize feedback noise. You will be able to unmute yourself during the question and answer period to comment and ask questions. To have the best Zoom experience, I suggest you use the speaker view setting on your computer. Just click on the view icon in the upper right-hand corner and choose speaker. On your iPad, you will find it in the upper left-hand corner, I believe. During the presentation, the chat function will be disabled. We will enable it during the Q&A and the discussion section. But for the next few minutes, the chat will be available, and if you'd like to introduce yourself, please type in your name, where you live now, and if you or your parents or grandparents had lived in Chicago between 1950 and 1970. What neighborhood did they live in? So if you can give us that little information, we'll sort of look through it later and see if there's any similarities. So now it is with great pleasure that we welcome Linda Gartz to talk about her memoir, Redlined. Personally, I found her memoir to be both a window into Chicago and her family's past, and a mirror reflecting back many of my own experiences during that time. Linda is a 6-time Emmy-honored documentary producer. Her documentaries and TV productions have been featured on ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS, and Investigation Discovery, syndicated nationwide. Her educational videos include Begin with Love, hosted by Oprah Winfrey, and Grandparenting, hosted by Maya Angelou. Her articles and essays have been published in literary journals, online, and in local and national magazines and newspapers, including the Chicago Tribune. Born in Chicago, she studied at both Northwestern University and at the University of Munich, and has lived most of her adult life in Evanston. She earned her BA and MAT degrees from Northwestern. Linda is one of those people, when I met her, I felt like I'd known her all my life. So with great pleasure, I'd like everyone to welcome Linda Gartz.
Well, hello, everybody. I am delighted to be here. Thank you to the National Council of Jewish Women for inviting me. And a special shout out goes to Debbie Wiedinghoff and to Melissa Prober for helping to plan this whole thing, and to Melissa for getting this whole PowerPoint together, which is not my expertise at all. So thank you to you both, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be here to be talking about my book, Redlined, which in its simplest summary, I would say is the story of my parents growing up, I should say my parents on the west side of Chicago, where I grew up, before, during, and after the neighborhood's racial change. And it's interwoven with the history of redlining. Now, redlining, I'm going to get into a little more later, a lot more actually, but at its simplest, redlining in America was the federal government's discriminatory policy of refusing loans, especially home loans, to African Americans and other minorities from 1933, when it was started under the Roosevelt administration, through 1968, when the Fair Housing Act made it illegal. But this discriminatory lending was based on color-coded maps, which we now have access to thanks to mappinginequality.com. So we'll talk about that later. So the focus of the book is primarily the 1960s, even though it covers several decades. And you may remember the 1960s as being one of the most tumultuous decades of the last century. But I wanted to start tonight by also acknowledging that we're living in a very tumultuous time right now, which you all know. But I think that I'm bringing that in as a connection. You know, the latest figures I've seen is that more than 220,000 Americans have died from COVID-19, and we've all been hunkered down, and we're trying to help raise our, have our children learn on video. It's just such a difficult time. But that deaths, the 220,000 deaths, is especially distressing when we realize that twice as many African Americans are dying from the coronavirus than white Americans. And I think that I can draw a straight line from redlining to that fact today, why African Americans are so much more vulnerable to this disease. 4.5 times more African Americans than white Americans are hospitalized because of COVID. So we will find out as we go on here several of the reasons behind that. So we were all hunkered down and nervous and seeing people dying because of COVID. And then on May 30th, we had the horrible experience of watching George Floyd be murdered by a white policeman kneeling on his neck in a very casual stance. And what arose out of that were spontaneous protests around the world from hundreds of thousands of people. This is a picture of just one. Hundreds of thousands of people came out to talk about and to bring this the racial disparities to the fore. And I think there were many white people, this is an unprecedented number of white people that joined in these protests than any other protests about Black Lives Matter or justice, racial justice, and so on. So I really think that this was a turning point where many white Americans were finally realizing what Black Americans had been saying for years and decades. Now, when I saw these protests, as many of you also know, there was many in Chicago. And as usual with these kinds of protests, though many were peaceful, there were always some bad actors, thugs, anarchists, people who just like to sow chaos or just are criminals. And they took advantage of these peaceful protests to do looting. And I chose this picture. This is a man named Wasid Musa, and he's sitting amidst the rubble of his looted store, which was called African Food and Liquor in the 4100 block of West Madison Street. Well, this looting occurred just 2 blocks away from where I grew up. And it was like a deja vu experience for me because, of course, in 1968, this same area was looted and rioted in, and many buildings were set on fire. In fact, if you go to the first page of my website and click on my video for the book trailer, in the first few seconds, I was able to capture the actual flames that were filmed at the time. And they're as far as the eye can see, the west side was on fire. And it was really a very horrible time. And the next day, after the riots, and there were riots in over 200 American cities. And I think we have an image of what the aftermath of this looked like. This is a picture of one block on the west side of Chicago after those fires, after Martin Luther King was murdered. You can see the skeletal charred remains of buildings. Bulldozers then came in and tore these all down, leaving vacant lots. And to this day, you can find so many so many vacant lots on the west side of Chicago. It's really, it's a tragedy. The city just never stepped in to do anything about this. I'm just going to take a quick sip of water. Now, at the time of these riots, my parents still owned 3 small apartment buildings and took care of them themselves. They didn't have any manager. And this is an image, a picture of one of those apartments. This is apartment buildings. This is their very first home, which they bought in December of 1948. I often just say 1949 because we didn't move in until June of 1949. But this is at 4222 West Washington Boulevard, just 2 blocks away from the image I showed you before of the looted store, and right in the neighborhood of where all the rioting and burning was going on. The day after the riots, my parents came down to the neighborhood to take care of another one of their buildings, because riots or no, they were going to make sure they took care of their buildings. So when my parents, and I just have to point this out, if you can see there's leaded glass windows in the top of each of those windows, and they used to, when the sunlight came through, they used to the prisms in those leaded glass windows would throw rainbows on the floor. And I was a little girl, and I just thought that was fascinating. So yeah, so that was their first investment. And, you know, this was a natural stage for my dad, because he looked at his immigrant parents, my grandparents. They came to America in 1911. They settled in West Garfield Park in 1912. And in 1912, my grandfather got a job at Joe Nelson's saloon as the sandwich man. And, you know, he and my grandmother, you know, worked obsessively. They saved obsessively. And eventually, you know, after being janitors, they were able to purchase their own buildings. They were able to reach the American dream of home ownership. And that was something that was denied to most African Americans at the same time. But my dad saw this as he saw his parents be successful. In 1950, the census showed that this neighborhood was 99.75% white. We don't want to miss that 0.75%. And so there was no reason for my dad to not think this would be a perfect investment and would be a way for him to, you know, be able to save money to send his kids to college and so on. But what my parents didn't realize is that they were living kind of on a fault line of history. They had no way to know that in 20 years hence, there would be the kind of riots and racial upheaval that were so difficult for this neighborhood. So he bought this building thinking that this is going to be the future for his family. And we can remove the image of the house now. So these themes of racial change and my parents' shifting relationship, because actually the buildings itself caused a rift in my parents' relationship. These had always troubled me. You know, what happened? Why were my parents, you know, unhappy after a while? And also, what happened to my neighborhood? You know, I wanted to find that out. What happened to my neighborhood? Why, when one African-American person moved into the neighborhood, did all whites start fleeing by the thousands? Well, I couldn't have addressed this until I made a startling discovery. And that's what inspired me to write this book. In 1994, my mom passed away. And after her funeral, my brothers and I went through our home. We were kind of separating trash from treasure the way you do when you're getting a house ready for sale. And as we went through the house, we found that in the attic, my parents and grandparents had saved thousands and thousands of pages of letters, diaries, and documents. And we have a picture of what we did with those documents. We sorted them by the person that each piece related to most, and put them in banker's boxes that you see here, which came to be stored in my garage. These are not all of them. You can see some empty spaces. I have some in my house still. So once we had them separated into banker's boxes, we sat down together and made a spreadsheet. My brothers are much more techie than I am. And I don't expect you to read this. I'm just showing this as a spreadsheet to give you an idea of one page of about a 10-page spreadsheet that documented what was in each of those boxes. And as you can see, even with this detail, this is not every detail. It's the kind of overall picture, so we knew where to find things. But I didn't have time to go through all this stuff when I was when we had actually found it. So it came to be stored in my garage for many, many years. I was busy raising 2 little boys, and I just didn't have time. But then somewhere about 2002, a nagging voice started coming at me saying, gee, I wonder what's in those boxes. And I started going through them. Here is an image of a tiny, tiny portion of one box. You can see here, I've got several diaries open. We sorted them like all the diaries are in the same banker's box. Down below, you can see, you know, pictures of, there's one picture of me and my husband back in the day, and lots of other pictures from Europe and the 20s, 30s, and so on. So once I started pulling out some letters, I started reading some World War II letters that were to and from my uncle, who was studying to be a navigator. And I think we can lose this picture now. Anyway, my uncle was studying to be a navigator in World War II, and the letters flew back and forth, and they were so vivid. It was like I was whisked back to the 1940s. Everybody wrote about what they were doing at home, so I could almost recreate my parents' lives and my grandparents' lives during the 1940s through these letters. So I was hooked, and I started reading more and more diaries. And my mother started a diary in 1927 when she was just 10 years old. So here is a picture of one of her diaries. This was 1939, I somehow put the wrong, it's a typo. It's actually 1939 to early 1941. But this is the one that really was most tantalizing to me, because in this diary, my mom talks about meeting my father and falling in love. So I thought that it would be fun to just read a little piece of what happened in her meeting my dad. In May of 1941, I think we can lose this picture too. In May of 1941, my mom decided to go to a dance in downtown Chicago. And when she got there, whom should she see but Fred Gartz? Now, she'd seen and met and danced with Fred at a previous party, the previous November, but he'd never called her for a date. She couldn't figure out why. So this night, however, she sees him, she goes, says hello, he's invited to sit with her friends, and then they dance the night away. And when she comes home, she writes this in her diary. This is the first night. There's no doubt about it. I'm in love with him. He's really the first man I've met that I think I'd like to marry. Intelligent, crazy, fun, and we have no end of things to talk about. Well, my dad must have been a little slow on the uptake, because he didn't ask this gal out for a date for another 3 months. Now, she had to be giving off vibes that she liked him, but he was a little shy and a little reluctant to put his emotions on the line. So he finally asked my mom out, and for August 15th, 1941. And they go to Lincoln Park and take a nice walk in the summer breeze. They go to a movie, they go to a little brewery and have a beer and a sandwich, and then they go back to the park. Now, when my mom gets home that night, this is what she writes. I think we both know why we went back to the park. And I've put up here just a little bit of her actual handwriting, because nobody sees handwriting anymore. And the top, and shorthand to boot. So she says, I think we both know why we went back to the park. We sat on a bench hearing the lions roar and the quacking of a duck. Of course, that's the zoo. Oh, it was heavenly. He knows all the little innuendos of kissing, and I ain't so bad myself if I do say so. We kissed for about an hour and a half. Tonight was like a page from a storybook, and he definitely is the man I want to marry. Dear God, please let it come true. Well, these kind of ecstatic entries continue on, for every day. She writes in adorable little things, like she's almost more like a teenager than the 23-year-old she was. But, they're dating, and my dad is just a little, he's more shy. He's not the kind of person, he doesn't wear his emotions on his sleeve like my mom did. But finally, the following May, he finds his voice. And this is what my mom wrote that happened. Fred told me at 2:30 a.m. Sunday, May 17th, really that he loves me. One split second before he did so, I murmured, je t'aime, which of course he did not understand. Ever since then, we have been happier before than ever in our lives. Fred tells me the nicest things, that he loves me more all the time, that I get sweeter as time goes by, that he's never loved anyone like he has loved me, that he has wanted many things badly in life, but never anything half so much as he wants me. We have never had an argument since our first date, August 15th, 1941. So if we won't be happily married, who will? Well, I chose this picture because it's one of the earliest pictures I have, and it was my mom and dad at North Avenue Beach. But that last line of hers, if we won't be happily married, who will? I think it's a very common feeling among young people in love. But unfortunately, when I was a teenager, my parents were definitely not happy. My mom was screaming at my dad because he had saddled her with this rooming house, and my father would retreat because he hated to have any kind of arguments. So I wanted to figure out, what had happened to my parents' relationship, and I thought maybe if I read all the diaries and letters, I would find that out. But there was another thing I wanted to understand. I wanted to understand what had happened to our neighborhood. Why, after one African American person and family moved on the block, why did all the whites flee? So for that, I couldn't turn to the diaries. I had to turn to research. And so then that's when I really discovered what redlining was all about. I'm going to read a portion of of my chapter called Redlined in my book. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I think it is the way we can look at redlining and how the fears of Blacks moving into neighborhoods began. First of all, let's take a look at this photo we have of a family that came north during the Great Migration in the early part of this century, of the last century. We have a picture of a family. They are an African American family, and I think we have that. There we go. For years, nobody knew who this family was. This picture showed up in a 1920s book that was trying to understand what had happened with the 1919 race riots in Chicago, which were some of the worst race riots the country has ever seen. And so this was a book about the Great Migration and the people, the African-American people who were flocking to the cities. So as I said, for years, people didn't know who this family was. So somebody at WBEZ's Curious City decided to do some research, and they found a Chicago Defender article that has this very picture in it. And here it is: family driven from the South by a mob. And underneath the picture, it talks about how this family had to leave the South because one of their family members was accused of killing a white person. And they grabbed a couple of the family members, the men, burned them alive, and then assaulted the women. So the ones who were able to get away somehow got to Chicago. You can imagine how traumatized they must have been. But this is what was going on starting in a wave in World War I. And I'll read you a little bit more about it from my book, from my chapter in called Redlined. Okay. Like most American cities in 20th century America, Chicago was rigidly segregated. African Americans were clustered primarily in Chicago's near west side and in the South Side's Black Belt, a strip of land that stretched from about 28th Street to 70th Street in 1940 and inexorably expanded as Blacks flocked to the city. Chicago's Black population had been burgeoning in these two neighborhoods ever since the beginning of the Great Migration, when vast numbers of Southern Blacks moved north, starting near the end of World War I and gaining steam in a second wave after World War II. In the 1940s and 50s, 3 million Blacks fled north from the daily degradations and abuses of the Jim Crow South. Hundreds of thousands headed to Chicago, where the Black population nearly tripled from almost 278,000 in 1940 to more than 812,000 in 1960. So you can see in just those 2 years, you have triple the population of African Americans in Chicago, and they're all being forced into these neighborhoods that then become incredibly overcrowded. Like my parents, many whites remained unaware that this massive population shift was underway or the reasons behind it. They just knew they didn't want African Americans moving into their white neighborhoods. Most whites were certain that Blacks brought decay and dilapidation into every community they entered. When I was young, we sometimes drove through African American neighborhoods on our way elsewhere, and we witnessed blight firsthand. Sagging porches and dirty windows, no grass, only twisting weeds and dusty front yards. A ferocious white backlash erupted when Blacks moved into an all-white area. In July of 1953, a Black couple purchased a home in all-white South Deering on Chicago's South Side. For months, white crowds protested and rioted, hurling bricks, shooting off pistols, and attacking and injuring Black passers-by. One of the picketers, who was interviewed by a CBS reporter, said this: "She didn't want Blacks in her community because," and I quote, "every place they've taken over, they've turned into a slum," end quote. Whites were certain that Blacks would devastate their communities, and alongside that would destroy whites' greatest investment, the value of their homes. In her epic book about the Great Migration, Isabel Wilkerson writes, quote, "It was an article of faith among many people in Chicago and other big cities that the arrival of colored people in all-white neighborhoods automatically lowered property values. That economic fear was helping propel the violent defense of white neighborhoods. The fears were not unfounded, but not for the reasons white residents were led to believe. Years later, I learned that the real culprits behind the decrepitude and the lowering value of white homes were the policies of the federal government in alliance with the real estate and mortgage sectors. In the 1930s, the newly created Home Owners Loan Corporation, called HOLC, H-O-L-C for short, along with the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, and other government agencies, began ranking communities to assess their creditworthiness from A, green, the highest, through D, red, the lowest. So that is just a portion of a chapter, and I'm just going to go off book now and just talk a little bit more about exactly how redlining worked and what it looked like in the cities. I got all the maps that I'm going to show you from a site called mappinginequality.com, and I highly recommend that you check that out if you have greater interest in this, because you'll learn a tremendous amount about redlining, and it's an interactive map, so you can go to about 239 cities and break it down by neighborhood, as I'll show you I did with my neighborhood, to see which areas were given which color. Okay, so the four colors that they used on these maps were green. A was considered the best. You can be sure this was an all-white neighborhood with people with a pretty good income. This housing stock was good. B would be blue, and that was considered still desirable. C was called definitely declining, it was yellow, and D was called hazardous. These colors were meant to help banks and real estate people understand which communities were safe to lend money in. And hazardous, if a community was labeled hazardous, it was also called redlined. No mortgages were to be given to anybody in that neighborhood. And it would be called hazardous for many reasons. It could be because the housing stock was very old and poor, but often it was because of the type of people in the neighborhood. Sometimes they would even say, you know, Italians are coming in. Foreigners seem to be a big issue for the people who made these maps. But for sure, if one African-American person lived in a neighborhood, then that neighborhood was redlined. And nobody in that neighborhood could get a loan. So whites could flee, they could go to the suburbs or whatever, wherever, and that's where the FHA money went. It all went following white people to the suburbs, and there was very little FHA protection given to any African Americans. This map I'm showing of the United States, because I think it shows how widespread across the entire country redlining was. It's usually in bigger cities, but you can see it stretches from Seattle to Miami. The East and Northeast look like they have the most. And you can see that most of these cities are either yellow or red. There's very little blue or green in them. I think they were being very cautious. But I wanted to take a look at the picture, the next image of a map. Okay, this is an image of Chicago. It's sort of the central part of Chicago. You know how Chicago is so long that you wouldn't see anything if I showed you the whole map. But if you see the the little yellow arrow there, that's pointing to my house, exactly where I lived. And that's at 4222 West Washington Boulevard. Those X's that you see were because it was a commercial district. So as you can see here in Chicago, there's a lot of red. And if you could see the whole map is either red or yellow, except at the far right, if you can see it, because that's where some of our thumbnail images are, there's a little green and blue along the lakefront. Of course, that's where the toniest homes would be and the most expensive homes. All white, you can imagine. African Americans couldn't afford to buy in that area. So anyway, let's look at and I want to just point out how where my house is, you can see, even though we're yellow, definitely declining, which I will talk about in a minute, there's red all around us, which could be a danger for banks even wanting to give loans in our neighborhood. They looked at what the closest neighborhoods were like too. Now, if we take a closer look at another map, okay, now there again is where my house is, the orange arrow. I just would like to comment about the X's. I didn't know what they meant at first, and I posted on Facebook if anybody knew. And sure enough, I got a lot of answers because my a wonderful mentor in Milwaukee is the chair of the history department at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and she wrote a great book called Block by Block. She actually posted it on her Facebook page because she's a historian, and we got the answer. The X's mean commercial property. And this was known as the Madison Crawford in the early part of the century, and then it later became Madison Pulaski Commercial District. It was one of the most vibrant in the city. We had everything there. It was like a small town. We had multiple clothing stores. We had restaurants. We had a wonderful theater, the Marlboro Theater. It was one of those theater palaces, bakeries, 2 bakeries, hardware stores, paint stores. You name it, you could find it in the neighborhood. And if you go there now, and I was just there last week, it is after 52 years after the riots, the city still has not done enough to help that neighborhood. Madison Street is now more of a series of storefront churches. There are a few bigger stores, but it is just a tiny fraction of what it used to be. So one of the things that the FHA had said in its wisdom, in its manual of underwriting, they said that inharmonious racial groups should not live together. So this was kind of the underlying point that they were making in making these decisions about what neighborhoods should be redlined. They felt that blacks and whites should not live together, and so these federal government policies were made to pretty much prevent African Americans from buying homes. Now, the result of that is that today, African Americans have 5 to 7% the wealth that whites have. A house that they could have afforded in the 1930s or 40s, by the time the Fair Housing Act was passed, and now, or 1980s, 2000s, the price of houses had increased so much faster than salaries. It was no longer possible for many African American families to get into the housing market as they could have in the 40s or 50s. And also, because these were segregated neighborhoods, these were less politically powerful people. So if there were a polluting industry that had to be placed somewhere, it was often placed in African American neighborhoods, in these segregated neighborhoods. And today, if you take a look at which neighborhoods are segregated in most places across the country, these were communities that were originally redlined by a federal government policy. And after you put some polluting industries in there, the air quality is bad. African American children have 3 times the asthma that white children do, that makes them miss school. And today, of course, these underlying health conditions that have come about because of living in neighborhoods that are often more polluted than white neighborhoods, that contributes to the vulnerability of African Americans to get COVID-19, to be hospitalized from it, and to die from it. So there are just so many bad results, especially health disparities, that can be traced back to redlining, because they forced African Americans into segregated communities. Some people like to say, well, African Americans just like to live with other Black people, just like whites want to live with whites. That would be called de facto segregation. But if any of you may have read The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein explains very clearly that this was not de facto, this was not by choice. This was a government policy. It was de jure, as he puts it, segregation by policy. So in any case, I feel that, after I had learned about redlining and I saw what happened with my parents and their relationship, and then what happened to our neighborhood, and my parents continued to stay and own property in this neighborhood, actually until my mom died in 1994. That's when I sold the house on the west side, the 2-flat that I showed you originally. We had moved 5 miles north, but my parents kept coming down to the west side to take care of their buildings. So, I felt almost compelled to write a book about this because I felt that it was a way of taking a family story and being able to tell also the story of redlining by interweaving those two things. I think it's more accessible to many people than sitting down with a big academic book. So you get sort of the basics of what redlining is and what it did through the eyes of people who had boots on the ground before, during, and after racial change, and how their own opinions of African Americans changed once they were able to find them as neighbors. My mother wrote in her diary, a few months, the first African American family moved on our block in June of 1963, and my parents, they were upset, like all the white people in the neighborhood. This is not good, they felt. But anyway, in a few months, she writes in her diary, "I am not at all unhappy in this changing neighborhood. I like my neighbors." And then she gives an example of many things, how kind and good the neighbors are. So we'll just look at the last slide and I'll finish up so we have time for questions. I put up the mappinginequality.com website, so you can check that out. And also my website has lots and lots of information. I didn't get into talking in detail about blockbusting, and maybe so that might come up in the questions, but this book can be bought at any place books are sold. And by the way, just as a special, right now, the ebook of Redline is being sold for just 99 cents. So you can give it as a gift or buy it for yourself. It's like 1/10 its normal price, 10% of its normal price. And that's going on just for a few more days. So take advantage of that if you read ebooks on Kindle, Apple Books, Google Play, and Kobo. Sorry, it's not on Barnes and Noble because they were having technical problems. Anyway, I'm going to just wrap it up there and say that this was a pleasure to be able to chat about my book a little bit. And I hope that it's given some insight into both my family as well as what happened on the West Side and how we are living today with a lot of the consequences of redlining. Redlining is a perfect example of systemic racism, which so many in upper parts of our government refuse to believe exists, which is crazy. And that's kind of also what we saw with George Floyd. I mean, there's the implicit bias that was in so many police officers that sometimes, and I'm not condemning all police officers because I know that's not right, but there are incidents of African Americans being killed by police much more than white people. And there's a lot of research that backs that up. And I'm sure all of you could find that on Google. So I'm going to wrap it up now and turn it back over to Debbie and Melissa for questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Linda. You answered a lot of my questions that I was going to ask. Before we go on to questions, we just want to do a quick little poll. It should be on the front on your screen. When did you first learn about the practice of redlining? If everyone could just quickly answer. I have one that in particular, I'm trying to see if anybody will answer. So, and I'm never sure how the results of this come up, but I'm hoping Melissa will tell me or show us.
Well, that'll be interesting. We'll be interesting to see that.
Yeah.
I don't
sure
want to make any comments because I don't want to influence what anybody says.
So I'm going to let Melissa put them up on the screen, I think. In the meantime, There it is. So so 7% tonight and from reading the book,
Oh,
2% from history class. That was the
course.
one I was interested in
Exactly.
to see if anyone knew about it then. Within the last 5 years, 30%. And we have a pretty knowledgeable group here,
I'd say so.
53% say they had heard of it before. I think within the last 6 months in particular, I think many of us may have heard of it.
Yes, I think that this, after George Floyd died, I noticed on the New York Times bestseller list for nonfiction that at some point there were like half the books had to do with race. So I think a lot of people after George Floyd's death, trying to understand why that could happen, were trying to, get themselves more educated about race.
Yes.
But when you think about 53%, so here's this policy that has really shaped our cities. And I think I'm delighted that the 53% no, but it's really, we can see how our education fails us. This is not, I think Richard Rothstein said at one of his presentations I saw, it's the Color of Law author, he said that the most used textbook in the country has like one sentence about redlining, and it's in the passive voice, like African Americans found themselves in all Black neighborhoods. Found themselves, like somebody was like aliens put them there.
I'm actually surprised that 2% actually heard about it in their classroom.
Yeah,
that would be a lot.
They must be younger.
Yes. So we do have a few questions. One was, it's from Amy. If you don't mind sharing, what did you find out about why your parents became unhappy? What?
Okay, well, I didn't
story.
Okay, there it is, sort of long, but I think I can sum it up. Okay, well, as I mentioned, they bought that house that was on the screen for a while. You'll get to see a beautiful house. So my dad had it in his mind, he wanted to change this into a rooming house, which of course was not technically legal, but that time you could just get away with anything. But anyway, my parents, unlike other people who would have done this, were very fastidious about building care. So anyway, they turned it into a rooming house. And just at that time, just when my dad and mom had bought this building when they moved in 49, my dad lost his job. And he looked all summer, and finally he got a job, and that required like about 6 months per year of travel. But he desperately wanted this rooming house. And I can only think now that he was trying to impress his parents. So he would be gone. So he imposed this sort of on my mom. She was okay with the rooms upstairs, but she was not okay with putting 3 apartments in the basement, which they ended up doing. Everything's furnished, by the way. They would furnish all these apartments. So you can imagine the people who rented them really had nothing. I mean, they didn't have anything except the clothes on their back or whatever they brought. So she was tasked with, she was the financial manager. She was the one who did the income tax. She paid all the bills. She was the one who knew all this. And then he'd leave. And now this was his job. He's also trying to support his family, but he'd be gone in the winter. He'd be gone sometimes for 6 to 7 weeks. So she's shoveling snow, she's shoveling coal because we had a coal burning furnace. And, taking care of the parents, not the parents, the tenants. Also, which I wasn't able to get into, but I'll briefly state here, my mother's mother was seriously mentally ill. And my mother brought her into their home in like 1943, right after, like 10 months after my parents were married. They put this, I'm going to just silence this phone that's boinging.
That was you.
That was me. I should have silenced it.
I was going to say, well, she does that. So her story is it's much more than about redlining. It's about mental health issues. It's about feminism. It's about a number of different issues that were going on in the 60s, which I thought was very relatable. So you can continue.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but it is. I kind of was focusing
today. It's a
big
story.
Yeah. But anyway, so we have this very, very mentally ill woman who's living in the house, who actually physically attacks my mother and father. So this, I think, really, my father accept, I don't know any other man that I've ever met that would have accepted this for 15 years. And he did. So but he was, I think he became resentful. Then my mother became resentful because he wasn't happy to have this great, very mentally ill woman in the house. So all these things kind of ate at their relationship until like finally in like the late 60s, early 70s, my mom had just had it. And she was a very emotional person. And she, didn't, what they needed was counseling. But anyway, that was out of the question. And if I had known then what I know now, I would have really, really encouraged them, especially even my mom alone, into counseling. But anyway, so all these things ate at their, and then my father's parents were also very unkind to them. So all in all, it was just outside pressures. I mean, they were so happy, and it really is distressing to think that this home that, they'd saved for my mother's entire salary for 4 years to buy it, became a source of undermining their relationship. So that's kind of what happened in a nutshell. But there's a lot more detail.
We have a few other questions. Okay. One was that if so many African Americans have missed the opportunity for wealth generation through the housing market, what is the solution? What do you recommend? Oh, just fix the whole problem, would you, Linda? Do you recommend reparations? Is that a part of it?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Sure. Well, that is, I mean, there is a recent book that has come out. I heard an interview on NPR where the authors make a very strong argument for reparations. And these particular people believe that the reparations should be given directly to African Americans in the form of, real money, real cash, because I mean, literally, billions of dollars were plundered from African Americans because they were unable to invest in the market. And even today, their houses in Black neighborhoods of the same quality as a house in a white neighborhood will be worth a lot less. So then there's also the idea that has been floated around of just investing more in the communities themselves. In other words, we've seen how with this pandemic, there's money. If there's a disaster or something that we need to fix, we were able to send money to, millions of Americans who lost their jobs, which I'm delighted we could do. But we're always saying, oh, no, we don't have any money for reparations, even though, all of us who are able to buy houses and invest in the market, one friend said to me, well, but if you give reparations, if you, give something back, that's my money. You're giving back my money. But my point is that we have all benefited, even if we didn't cause this, we have benefited by being able to invest in property and have intergenerational wealth that we can pass on to our children. So I think, I don't have the answer, obviously. First of all, we have to first acknowledge that this is a problem, which, right now our present government won't even acknowledge that such a thing as systemic racism exists. So it's going to have to be a bipartisan discussion that, that's going to go back and forth. I think money has to be infused into these neighborhoods one way or another.
Okay. There are many other questions coming in.
Okay.
So
I'll try to make it quick. I'll try to shorten my
answer. One question is from Ria. You said that most of the people in Chicago were unaware of the Great Migration of African Americans from the South moving north. Mm-hmm. Why do you think they were so unaware of this happening?
Well, all I can, I think because we just lived in separate worlds. As I write in the book, when we lived in our all-white neighborhood, we just didn't have to do we had no interactions with African American people. The African Americans, when they came to Chicago and other big cities, were generally shoved into these segregated communities. I mean, sometimes these houses would be split up and have like 7 apartments in what would have been 1 apartment. And these were really, these were terrible. They weren't maintained. They had toilets and closets. They were just falling apart. So they were in a separate world. I say that, we never saw African Americans unless we drove through an African American neighborhood. Now there were no African Americans on TV. There were, except for Amos and Andy, you know, which is now considered racist. The first time I saw an African American in a starring role was in with that Robert. What was that
I
called?
Spy.
Thank you. I Spy. Thank you. We remember it. So, I mean, that's how memorable it is, right? The first time you see an African American. When I was at Northwestern, my junior year, we nominated an African American young woman, Daphne Maxwell, who's now an actress, you know, was the first African American ever to be homecoming queen. You know, we're all in separate worlds. So that's why I know my parents didn't know about it. They just figured blacks have their neighborhood and we have our neighborhood, and that's how it should be.
I think you're right. So a number of the comments are about different cities. So I'm not sure how much you know about these things,
Yeah.
but I will, maybe just one of the comments here was from Kathy. She said, in St. Louis, where she grew up, the problem was so bad that the city established the first land bank in 1971 to deal with the issue. And then someone else said that in Detroit, these land banks were also established. Are you familiar with those?
I'm not really familiar with the land banks. I'm assuming that these were banks that were going to try to lend money at better rates to African Americans. Is that?
That's what I'm gathering from what was written.
That's what I gathered.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't see that in Chicago.
Okay. I have, perhaps you could just speak, I know we're running out of time, speak to the other problem I think that you talked about in your book was about contract sales.
Oh yeah, sure.
I don't think we touched on that.
Yeah, this is a big deal. Because of redlining, nobody could get a mortgage in a redline neighborhood, not even the white person. Okay, so the maps I showed you, if you go to mapping inequality, you can see them little sections by sections of a community. So what happened was, if a white person then wanted to leave the neighborhood, or maybe didn't even want to at the time, but these unscrupulous real estate agents would go to the white people's homes, or they would call them and say, you know, this week I might give you, let's say, $10,000 for your house, but next week it might only be $9,000. So they panic peddled. Sometimes they would actually hire an African American woman to walk in the neighborhood with a baby carriage, so that people would think that the neighborhood was going colored, as they would say at the time. And so they would buy from the whites at undervalued prices, and then they would turn around and sell them to African American families. But since they couldn't get a mortgage, they had to buy on contract. And buying on contract meant that you never held a deed to the house. You were paying money, but this money was not going toward the house. There's a protection in a mortgage in that you are building equity as you pay. But African Americans in these neighborhoods could sometimes pay up to 50, 60% the value of their home. And if they missed one payment, they were evicted. I have a link on my website I have a lot of resources, and it's to an article called Confessions of a Blockbuster. It's from the Saturday Evening Post in 1962. You can click on that link if you're interested. It's not a real blockbuster, but someone who wanted to expose blockbusting. So he called it Confessions of a Blockbuster and wrote it in first person to say, if you can't make money in this business, you don't know what you're doing. So it's very much a worthwhile read.
Great, thank you. Well, we have many others and we are running out of time. So perhaps in a follow-up email, if there's some of these questions we can answer, we'll send it in the follow-up. And just to go back, I mean, I know we didn't have time to go through where people came from, but I hope people got a chance to sort of look where everyone was from. Some from the very neighborhoods you were talking about in your book. So it was interesting. So we have but a few minutes, and Melissa's going to put something up there. And I'm going to thank you, Linda. I hope I'm going to just.
Oh, this is great. Yeah, I printed this out.
Okay. I want to, first of all, of course, thank Linda for her time and her book and all her expertise. And
Thank you.
just being available to us is really wonderful. And she's right here in Evanston, so we love that. I hope one day we can actually meet in person. That would be
So
fabulous.
I hope so.
Be
Sooner rather than
fabulous
later.
again. To conclude, I just want to talk a few seconds about, and if everyone, wish that there was a way for us to applaud, Linda, but you'll have to just get my applause. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Debbie. You're very welcome. It's my pleasure. Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks. So just a couple of things to mention. Melissa, go back. I was talking too slowly. Coming up this month is November is Food Insecurity Month for NCJW Gives Back. And here's a whole list of items that we are trying to collect for the ARC, Niles Township Food Pantry, and the Nuestro Center in Highwood. For more information and to see the list and even to register about pickup or donation sites, you can go to our website, ncjwcns.org. And basically, if you click on the NCJW Gives Back, you'll be able to get to all this information. So in November, if you could do that, the first pickup collection dates are the 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th. Next, just to talk about save the date. We're doing cookies, cocktails, and conversation on Sunday, December 6th. It's a Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock, intergenerational, hoping to celebrate the holidays. We'll have Rabbi Danya Rutenberg with us, and she'll light the candles and tell a little Hanukkah story, and we have other things planned. So hopefully, if your grandchildren live across the country, they can join you on Zoom for this event. More information to come on that one. And then finally, we all know that next Tuesday is Election Day, and that we might need a little sense of community, maybe a little inspiration, a little spiritual nourishment. So NCJW National is hosting this event. So there'll be some Torah study opportunities, musical performances, meditation moments, poetry readings, and more. And we'll have artists and musicians and rabbis. So if you need a little nourishment while we're waiting for the returns to come in, it might be a good place to be. It's going to go on for most of the evening, so you can probably come in and out. I think you need to register for this at ncjw.org, correct? Yes, Melissa wrote that in the chat. And that is our evening. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Linda. If you have not read the book, please go out and get it and read it, especially if you are of a child of the 60s. I think much of it will ring true, especially if you grew up in Chicago. So,
and don't forget, if you do have if you do read on a Kindle or anything, or any of those devices, it is 99 cents.
Quite the bargain.
Until the scary day of Halloween. So,
okay. So thank you all for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Oh, I forgot one thing. Thank you, Melissa. Just a little survey up here to help us plan our 2021 programming. Tell us what top 2 action items you'd like us to bring to you virtually. What do you want to learn more about? Because we are going to be virtual for the next forever, it seems. So whichever 2 you think you'd like to learn more about, just click on those and we'll see where we're at. There you go. And once you do that, good night, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I hope you'll come to one of our other events.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Linda.
Okay, bye, everybody.